There are moments in history so surreal, so brutal, and yet so human that they seem to exist outside of time. The French Revolution was filled with such moments, days when the old world clashed violently with the new, when loyalty became a crime, and when the line between civilization and chaos vanished in the roar of the crowd. One of the most haunting of those moments belongs to a woman whose name is now half forgotten, though her story should never be. Her name was Marie Therese Louise of Savoy, known to the French court as the Princess de Lamballe. She was no revolutionary, no queen, no military commander. And yet, on September 3rd, 1792, she became a symbol, a victim not just of politics or war, but of what happens when fear and rage overtake reason. Her story is one of devotion, defiance, and destruction. Born in Turin in 1749 into the House of Savoy-Carignan, Lamballe was raised in one of Europe's most prestigious aristocratic families. Her early life was defined by privilege and expectations, and, as with so many noble women of her time, by a marriage that was meant to strengthen dynastic ties rather than emotional bonds. At just 17, she married Louis Alexander de Bourbon, Prince de Lamballe, a man of immense fortune and status. But the fairy tale never had time to unfold. Within a year of their wedding, her husband was dead, leaving her a widow before her 18th birthday. It was a personal tragedy that could have easily removed her from public life, but instead it led her to the very heart of the Ancien regime, the royal court at Versailles. There, in the radiant and politically charged atmosphere of Louis XVI court, she crossed paths with another young woman who, like herself, was a foreigner navigating French nobility, Marie Antoinette. Their friendship was immediate and genuine, a rare bond in a world where alliances were often forged out of calculation rather than sincerity. While most courtiers played roles in a perpetual theater of politics, Lamballe and the young Austrian-born queen found something more honest in one another. In time, that friendship was formalized with power. Marie Antoinette appointed Lamballe as the superintendent of the queen's household, a prestigious and deeply personal position that placed her closer to the queen than almost anyone else. She wasn't just a lady-in-waiting. She was family in all but blood. But as the political winds in France began to shift and the monarchy's popularity began to collapse, the queen's inner circle quickly became a target. Revolutionary pamphlets, often grotesquely sensational, were distributed throughout Paris, accusing Marie Antoinette and her closest companions of everything from corruption to espionage, and even of scandalous personal relationships. These publications weren't based on fact. They were weapons designed to dehumanize, to inflame, and to turn public anger into action. Lamballe, despite her quiet demeanor and restrained public presence, was transformed in the minds of the people into a caricature, a foreign manipulator, a corrupting influence, even an enemy of France. She had done nothing to warrant this image, and yet it stuck, reinforced by rumor, by fear, and by political necessity. Then came 1789. The storming of the Bastille sent shockwaves through the entire monarchy. France was unraveling. As chaos spread, aristocrats and royal allies fled the country in droves. Many were captured or executed. Lamballe, at that moment, was not in France. She was safe in London, far from the fire consuming her homeland. Her family and friends urged her to remain where she was, to stay out of reach of the revolution's escalating violence. But she refused. The queen had summoned her. Marie Antoinette, desperate and increasingly isolated, asked her to return to Paris, and Lamballe, whose loyalty had never wavered, answered that call. She knew the risk. Before leaving London, she sat down and wrote her will, a quiet but unmistakable acknowledgement that she might not return alive. She walked straight into a collapsing world, into a capital where mobs now ruled the streets and the monarchy teetered on the edge of oblivion. She was with the royal family during some of their darkest moments. When the king and queen attempted to flee the country and failed, an event that shattered any remaining illusions about the monarchy's survival, she was there. And on June 20th, 1792, when an enraged mob stormed the Tuileries Palace, she remained calm. Eyewitnesses say she was concerned only for the queen's safety, never her own. That kind of devotion in a time like that was rare, and it would cost her everything. On September 3rd, 1792, during what would become known as the September Massacres, Lamballe was taken from her prison and brought before a hastily formed tribunal. The Revolutionary Court demanded that she swear loyalty to the newly declared republic and renounce the monarchy she had served all her life. She refused. What followed was not an execution in any formal sense. It was a breakdown of order, a moment of such intense mob violence that even those who participated later struggled to describe it without trembling. The worst and most grotesque legends surrounding her death, the kinds you find repeated in sensationalist accounts, are often exaggerated or entirely false. But even the verified truth is horrifying. She was attacked and killed by an angry crowd in one of the darkest episodes of the revolution. Her body was not treated with dignity. Parts of it were paraded through the streets, reportedly as a warning and a symbol of the revolution's new power. While many details were distorted over time, one thing remains clear. The hatred directed at her had little to do with her as a person. Lamballe had no real political influence, no armies, no secret plots. Her only crime was her loyalty, her unwavering devotion to a queen who, by then, had become the most hated woman in France. Marie Antoinette was devastated by her friend's death. Accounts say she fainted upon hearing the news and never truly recovered from the emotional blow. But Lamballe's story didn't end in 1792. It continued as a warning, as a legend, and as a reflection of just how quickly a society can turn on one of its own. Her death remains one of the most disturbing reminders of what can happen when individuals become symbols, when loyalty becomes treason, and when humanity is consumed by fear. The story of the Princess de Lamballe is not just a tragedy of a woman caught in the gears of revolution. It is a window into a time when the world turned upside down, and when friendship, loyalty, and love became reasons to die. She was not a queen. She was not a soldier. She was not a revolutionary. She was a friend. And in the end, she paid the ultimate price for standing by someone she refused to abandon. August 10th, 1792, marked a point of no return in French history. On that day, the monarchy, an institution that had stood for over 1,000 years, was brought to its knees in a single, ferocious blow. The storming of the Tuileries Palace, where King Louis XVI and his family had taken refuge, unleashed a torrent of rage that had been building for years. Once the palace fell, the royal family was imprisoned in the Temple, a medieval fortress in the heart of Paris that now served as their makeshift dungeon. Among those swept up in this dramatic reversal of fortune was Marie-Thérèse Louise de Savoy-Carignan, the Princess de Lamballe. As one of Queen Marie Antoinette's closest confidants and superintendent of her household, Lamballe had always lived a life of privilege and grace. But revolution has no patience for grace, and friendship with a queen in such a moment was a deadly burden. Shortly after the royal family was incarcerated, Lamballe was separated from them and transferred to La Force prison. Unlike the elegant halls she once knew of Versailles, La Force was infamous for its overcrowding, filth, and cruelty. It was not just a prison. It was a place where hope went to die. Dark, damp, and crawling with disease, it served as a grim symbol of what the revolution now stood for, not just liberty but punishment. As August wore on, Paris grew darker, not just in atmosphere, but in spirit. Outside the prison walls, the city had descended into a fever pitch of fear and hysteria. A coalition of foreign armies, Austrian and Prussian, was marching toward the capital. Their goal was clear: crush the revolution and restore the king to power. The commander of these forces, the Duke of Brunswick, issued a chilling manifesto warning that if a single hair on the king's head were harmed, the city of Paris would be destroyed without mercy. But instead of cowing the revolutionaries into submission, the threat ignited something more violent, a mass paranoia that consumed every street, every alley, every prison. The revolutionaries became convinced that the real danger wasn't coming from outside the city, but from within. They believed that Paris's jails were filled with traitors, aristocrats, clergymen, and counter-revolutionaries plotting in the shadows, waiting for their moment to strike. In this climate of fear, reason evaporated, and when reason disappears, blood often takes its place. On September 2nd, 1792, the madness boiled over. That afternoon, angry mobs stormed the prisons of Paris in what would become known as the September Massacres. Over the next 5 days, more than 1,000 prisoners would be slaughtered, not by guillotine, not by trial, but by hand, in the streets, in courtyards, in full view of the city. They were dragged from their cells, subjected to sham trials that lasted mere seconds, and then executed in a frenzy of steel and fury. The killings weren't silent or discreet. They were public, visceral, and grotesque. And they weren't just about punishment, they were about purification. The revolutionaries believed they were cleansing France of its enemies, one blade at a time. Inside La Force, the Princess de Lamballe could hear it all. The screams, the roars of the crowd, the pounding of fists on iron doors. She was locked in her cell, alone with the knowledge that death was not only close, it was almost certain. Unlike many of the prisoners around her, she wasn't just an anonymous noble. She was known, recognized, hated. Her face, her name, her history, all of it was tied directly to the Queen, to the very institution the mob wanted to obliterate. For many in the crowd, she wasn't a person anymore. She was a symbol. On the morning of September 3rd, her time came. The cell door creaked open, and 2 guards stood silently before her. They gave no explanation, offered no comfort, only a gesture to follow. She obeyed. As she walked through the prison corridors, her footsteps echoed against the damp stone walls. The air was thick with the scent of blood and rot. She must have known what awaited her, but she didn't beg or cry. She walked forward, composed, a figure of dignity in a world that had lost all of its own. Eventually, she was brought before a so-called tribunal, a mock court assembled inside the prison. But this was no courtroom. There were no judges in robes, no lawyers, no defenders of justice, just a few men seated at a crude wooden table stained with wine and worse. The floor beneath them was wet. Outside the window, the bodies were already beginning to pile up. She was asked a few perfunctory questions. Then came the real test, the one that mattered. They demanded she swear allegiance to liberty and equality, and, more damningly, hatred for the king and queen. This was not just a test of her beliefs. It was a test of her soul. And for Lamballe, there was only one answer. She replied calmly, "I will readily swear to liberty and equality, but I cannot swear hatred to the king and queen. It is not in my heart." A man standing nearby leaned in, whispering with urgency, "Swear. If you do not swear, you are dead." But she did not change her answer. Another account says she simply stated, "Whether I die sooner or later is of no consequence. I have already offered my life." What came next was swift. The head of the tribunal, without hesitation or ceremony, delivered her verdict. "Let Madame be set at liberty." Those words, under any other circumstance, might have meant freedom. But not here. Not now. In the twisted language of the September Massacres, set at liberty was a death sentence in disguise. It was the coded signal to the mob waiting just beyond the prison gates. She is yours. The door opened. She stepped into the courtyard. The scene that greeted her was one of unimaginable horror. The ground was slick, the walls stained, the air filled with a noise that was no longer quite human. A sea of faces turned toward her, eyes wide with hate, arms raised, weapons ready. She was no longer a princess, no longer even a prisoner. She was a target, and they closed in. What followed was not justice. It was not even revenge. It was something far more primal, an explosion of collective violence unleashed upon a single person. Her life ended not with ceremony or final words, but with chaos and then silence. The body of the Princess de Lamballe was never recovered in any respectful sense. What happened to her after that moment was the subject of countless rumors, many of them gruesome, some of them likely false, all of them haunted by the sheer brutality of that morning. But her final words and her refusal to betray the queen were remembered. In the end, Marie-Therese Louise de Lamballe died, not because of what she had done, but because of what she represented. In a time when symbols were more dangerous than swords, she became a casualty of the revolution's darkest hour. And her story still echoes centuries later, a chilling reminder that when the bonds of society snap, when fear replaces law and mobs take the place of reason, even the innocent can be swallowed whole. There are stories in history that go far beyond a realm of ordinary tragedy, stories so horrifying, so charged with sorrow and brutality that they seem to belong to some nightmare world rather than the real one. Yet they did happen. One such story is that of Marie-Therese Louise de Savoy-Carignan, better known as the Princess de Lamballe. Hers is not just a story of political violence. It's a story about the terrifying cost of loyalty, about how a person, through no fault of their own, can become a symbol in the eyes of a furious crowd, a lightning rod for vengeance, and ultimately a victim of unspeakable cruelty. In the final days of the French monarchy, as Paris was consumed by the fires of revolution, suspicion and rage began to rule over reason. The prisons were full, the streets were tense, and the revolutionary government was barely in control of the mob it had helped to awaken. Princess de Lamballe, a woman known for her quiet devotion to Queen Marie Antoinette, had made a fatal choice. Despite the chaos, despite the opportunity to escape, she returned to Paris. She walked willingly into a city gripped by madness, believing, perhaps naively, that her loyalty, her friendship, and her past good deeds would protect her. But she misjudged the moment. In that boiling atmosphere of fear and fanaticism, her titles, her proximity to the queen, and even her silence were enough to condemn her. What followed was not a trial. It was a farce. She was dragged before a makeshift tribunal just outside the gates of La Force prison. The judges, if they could even be called that, asked her one question: would she swear allegiance to the Republic and denounce the monarchy? Her response was neither loud nor defiant. She simply refused, and that was enough. The sentence was immediate. There was no written judgment, no formal declaration of guilt. She was handed over to the mob, whose thirst for blood had already been whetted by days of killing. For a brief moment, as she stood outside in her white dress, she seemed to pause amid the chaos. Witnesses described her as fragile-looking, almost spectral, alone amidst a sea of jeering faces. But that image quickly shattered. The first blow struck the back of her head, delivered by a pike or hammer. Her cap fell, and her long golden hair tumbled loose. A second strike, this time to her forehead, knocked her to the ground. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. And then, in seconds, the mob fell upon her. What followed can hardly be described as a killing. It was an eruption. The crowd stabbed, kicked, and beat her with whatever they could find. Pikes, swords, fists, boots. It was fast. It was chaotic. And it was devastatingly final. But even after her death, the horror escalated. Her head was severed from her body, an act meant not just to mutilate, but to transform, to turn her into something more than a victim, a message. The mob stripped her body and left it in the filth of the street, exposed to the elements like a trophy cast aside after a hunt. No burial, no ceremony, no dignity. Her remains were never properly recovered. These are not rumors. They are facts recorded in multiple independent accounts, many of which came from people who had no political reason to lie. The revolutionary authorities would later try to soften the narrative, but the truth was too brutal to hide. What the crowd did next was not spontaneous. It was a carefully staged act of psychological warfare. They mounted her severed head on a pike and began marching through the streets of Paris. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. Their destination, the Temple prison where the Queen and the royal family were being held. The purpose, to force Marie Antoinette to look at the mutilated face of her closest friend, to show her what happened to those who remained loyal. The mob moved like a grotesque procession, shouting and chanting, laughing and threatening. And at the very front of the line, bouncing grotesquely with each step, was the head of the Princess de Lamballe. When they reached the prison, they gathered under the window where they believed the queen to be. They called out her name. They screamed for her to come look. Some even claimed they wanted her to kiss the lips of her dead friend. Inside, the royal family heard the uproar. A valet to the king looked outside, saw the head, and recognized it immediately. When Marie Antoinette asked what was happening, one of the guards, unable to lie, answered plainly, "They're trying to show you the head of the Princess de Lamballe. We don't know if the queen actually saw it." Some accounts say the guards managed to block her view in time. Others suggest she caught a glimpse before collapsing. What we do know is that she screamed and fainted. She reportedly wept through the night, inconsolable. The message had been received. The mob had done more than kill. They had crushed, broken, and humiliated. But as horrifying as this verified history is, over time, it was overtaken by even darker myths. Grotesque exaggerations that took root and spread like poison through the historical record. Some claimed she had been assaulted before her death, that her body was mutilated in unspeakable ways, that her breasts had been cut off or her genitals desecrated. Others said her heart had been ripped out and devoured by the crowd. These stories were often cited by royalist writers who sought to portray the revolutionaries as demonic and subhuman. But crucially, none of these details appear in any trustworthy contemporary sources. In fact, we have documented records of items found in her clothing after death, proof that her body had not been stripped when it was discovered. Even eyewitnesses who despised the monarchy made no mention of such acts. These extreme claims are almost certainly fabrications designed to amplify outrage. The grotesque legends didn't stop there. One tale claimed her head was taken to a local hairdresser, powdered, styled, and perfumed before being carried to the queen. Another said she had hidden a message to Marie Antoinette within her hair, one final gesture of loyalty. And perhaps the most infamous myth of all, that the queen was forced to kiss the lips of her friend's severed head. These stories have no basis. In fact, they appear nowhere in the first-hand records of those present. But they were irresistible to those who wanted either to demonize the revolutionaries or to dramatize the suffering of the royal family. Why then do such myths persist? Perhaps because the truth is so horrifying that it demands exaggeration to be understood. Perhaps because people, in their grief and rage, need villains more monstrous than reality allows. Or perhaps it's simply because human beings are drawn to stories, especially the macabre ones. But in doing so, we risk forgetting the real woman at the center of this horror. She becomes less a person and more a canvas for other people's nightmares. Her real life, her kindness, her dignity, her loyalty is lost beneath the noise. In the end, what happened to the Princess de Lamballe was not a state-sanctioned execution. It was a lynching, a ritualized public murder fueled by rage, hysteria, and the terrifying power of a crowd that had stopped seeing its victims as human. She was not targeted for anything she did, but for who she was and whom she loved. Her death remains one of the most savage moments of the French Revolution, not because of the myths, but because of the facts. She died for refusing to abandon her friend. She died because loyalty, in a time of revolution, had become a death sentence. Her story is a warning not just about the dangers of political extremism, but about how quickly ordinary people can become agents of unthinkable cruelty. It is about how mobs erase nuance, how symbols replace individuals, and how a life can be destroyed simply to make a point. The most horrifying stories in history are not the ones that are made up, they are the ones that are true. So what do you think? Is it better for history to focus solely on verified facts? Or is there something to be learned from the myths too? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you're drawn to the shadows of history, the places where truth and terror intertwine, don't forget to subscribe. Because sometimes the past doesn't whisper, it screams.